Wyoming. The coldest winter in 40 years settled over Coldwater Bend like a judgment waiting to be pronounced. Smoke rose thin from chimneys along Main Street. Frost claimed window panes before noon. Men walked with shoulders hunched, breath visible in clouds that hung too long in the still air. The town had seen hard seasons before. Blizzards in '79. Ice storms in '94. Livestock losses that still got mentioned at the feed store. But those were stories now polished smooth by repetition, stripped of their original terror. This winter felt different to those who still remembered how to listen. No ravens crossed the valley. Dogs stayed close to porches. Wind moved high along the ridgeline but refused to descend into town, as if something up there had staked a claim the weather itself respected. Most people noticed nothing. They stacked their usual amount of firewood. They checked their usual list of supplies. They trusted in the patterns that had carried them through before, never considering that patterns sometimes break at the moment you need them most. A mile above town, carved into the granite face of the western slope, Reese Thorne sat in warmth that defied every assumption the valley below had made about her. Fresh kale grew dark and thick under polished reflector lamps. Winter spinach spread in neat rows ready for harvest. A shallow stone basin held brook trout that flashed silver when lamplight caught their movement. Water ran clean through a channel she had cut with her own hands, filtered through gravel and sand and charcoal before reaching the covered reservoir. The air inside stayed steady at 68 degrees. Not hot, not stale, steady. She was 43 years old and built like someone who understood that survival was a discipline practiced daily, not a crisis managed poorly. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, hands scarred in places that told stories she never shared. A small scar crossed her left eyebrow. Another traced pale along her jawline. She never explained either one. The town knew only what rumor had assembled from fragments. Former military. Came west alone 3 years ago. Bought an abandoned piece of slope land no rancher wanted. Started hauling stone and lumber uphill by herself. Everything after that became speculation dressed up as fact. Ash lay near the entrance, one ear turned toward the outer door. The dog was a Belgian Malinois black coat. Hard eyes and the kind of stillness that came from years of waiting for commands that could mean life or death. He never barked to hear himself, never begged, never wandered. When Reese moved, Ash moved. When she stopped, he stopped. They had been through things together that left no room for hesitation. The bond between them was forged in places where mistakes were not forgiven. And trust was the only currency that mattered. The shelter was not a cave. It was a system. Reese had found the old hollow left by trappers decades before, studied the slope above it, then spent 26 months turning dead space into something that could sustain life when everything outside tried to kill it. She drove the main room deeper into the hillside where frost moved slower and wind had less authority. Timber framed the front wall. Stone carried the weight behind it. Earth insulated the rest. Every decision served a purpose. Every tool had its place. Nothing was decorative. Everything was essential. Along the south wall ran the thermal mass bench, 32 feet from end to end. Most people who glanced at it saw oversized furniture. They were wrong. Inside that mass of slate-red clay and river sand, A line of ceramic flue pipe wound back and forth before reaching the outer stack. At the near end sat a small cast-iron firebox, no larger than a footlocker. It took 2 split logs, sometimes 3 in deep cold, and no more than that. Reese would light the charge, close the draft, and let the flame burn hot and clean. Heat traveled sideways first through the buried pipe, surrendering itself to the clay and slate. By the time smoke reached open air, much of its value had already been claimed by the wall. The bench absorbed warmth slowly, then gave it back for hours. No wild temperature swings. No freezing corners 10 feet from a blazing stove. No waking at midnight to feed a hungry iron box. Ash often slept against the far end where the stone stayed warm longest. It was the kind of system that required thought before construction and patience during operation. 2 things most people in Coldwater Bend had never connected to survival. For 3 years, they had watched her build. For 3 years, they had laughed. She became the woman under the mountain, the fool with dirt walls, the person who chose isolation over neighbors. The jokes started small. They grew sharper. By the time the first snow fell each season, someone always found a way to remind her that real winter would expose her foolishness. She never responded, never defended herself, never wasted breath trying to convince people who had already decided what she was. On a gray afternoon in late January, Reese walked into Marlowe Pruitt's general store with a short list and no patience for conversation. The store was the warmest place in town aside from the saloon. A potbelly stove glowed red at the center of the room. Men leaned back in chairs worn smooth by years of winter talk. The smell of coffee and wood smoke mixed with the faint scent of leather and gun oil. When the door opened and cold air followed Reese inside, every head turned. Dalton Pike laughed first. He always did. A big man who owned the largest cattle ranch in the valley. His voice usually arrived before the rest of him. He sat near the stove with his boots stretched toward the heat hat pushed back. Confidence worn like a second skin. "Well now," Dalton said, slapping his knee. The mountain queen came down to visit the common folk. A few men chuckled. Boone Cassidy, a young ranch hand eager to belong, laughed louder than necessary. Vernon Cade added the sharper edge. He ran the lumber mill when demand kept it open and considered sarcasm a form of intelligence. "Tell us this," Vernon said, leaning forward. "You growing oranges under that dirt yet? Or still just rabbit food?" More laughter. Reese gave none of them a glance worth remembering. She walked to the counter, set down her list, and waited. Lamp wicks, onion seeds, 1/4-inch screws. 2 pounds of salt. That was all. No defense. No irritation. No performance. Marlowe Pruitt gathered the items in silence. She had run the store long enough to know that noise often covered weakness. Her hands moved steady across paper sacks and scales. She did not join the room's amusement. There was something about Reese that reminded her of people who had already survived the thing everyone else still feared. Dalton leaned back again. "You still hiding in that dirt hole when the real cold comes?" Reese placed folded bills on the counter. Her voice came out level, neither loud nor soft, just stated. "Still warm there now." The room laughed again, but thinner this time. There was something in the way she stood that made mockery feel smaller than intended. Reese took her sack and turned toward the door. Ash rose from where he had been waiting, silent as a shadow. Some men argued because they needed victory. Some stayed quiet because they already knew where truth would be settled. As Reese shifted the sack, her coat opened for a moment. Marlowe caught a glimpse of what was tucked inside the inner pocket. An old photograph edge's worn colors faded. A young girl no more than 8, with a bright ribbon in her hair, and the kind of smile children wore before they learned what winter could take. Beside it, pinned to the fabric, was something else, a metal trident, small, polished, unmistakable to anyone who knew what it meant. Reese noticed the slip at once. She closed her coat with one calm hand and said nothing. Neither did Marlowe. But the room changed for the older woman in that instant. The jokes sounded cheaper. The laughter sounded hollow. She understood something the others did not. Some people lived apart because they despised humanity. Others did it because grief had rearranged the entire map of their lives and solitude was the only geography that still made sense. Marlowe watched Reese walk back into the cold and knew this was not a story about oddness at all. It was a story about loss buried so deep it could only be answered with preparation. The trident was a seal insignia. The photograph was a child who would never grow older. And the woman walking away had built an entire fortress against the possibility of failing someone again. That night, Reese placed the photograph back on the stone shelf above the warm wall. Lily's face looked out from a moment 6 years gone forever. Caught in an afternoon that ended badly, Reese stood there longer than usual, one hand resting on the rough timber frame. Ash settled at the base of the bench, one ear still turned toward the outer door. The shelter held its quiet heat. Water moved softly through the channel. Lamplight rested low across the room. "Don't let this year repeat itself," Reese said to the photograph. Her voice barely reached the walls. Outside, wind shifted north. Snow began to sweep across the slope in thin white lines, testing the ground before claiming it. Some people prayed in churches. Some prayed with tools walls and years of labor shaped by the kind of failure that never stopped teaching. Reese had done both. The following morning brought no sunrise. Sky and valley merged into one flat gray that made distance impossible to judge. Light never fully arrived. It only thinned the darkness enough for people to see the shape of what was coming. By noon, wind began to move along the ridges with a sound like freight trains passing in the dark. By afternoon, it found Main Street and did not stop. Reese was checking the sand filters on her water system when the first real gust hit the front wall. Ash lifted his head. The dog had spent years learning which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. This one mattered. Reese moved to the entrance and studied the sky through the gap in the outer door. Cloud cover had dropped so low it looked like the mountain was being pressed into the earth. The air had that strange electric stillness that came right before a storm stopped asking permission and started taking what it wanted. She returned to her systems and began final preparations with the kind of calm that came from training, not confidence. Training was repeatable. Confidence was a guess. She topped off the fish tank, checked every valve on the water channel, tightened the outer hinges, ran rope braces across the storm door, stacked extra split wood beside the firebox, where it would stay dry, moved 2 water buckets closer to the warm wall. Each action was small. Together they would mean the difference between comfort and crisis. Ash followed every movement quieter than usual, pausing often to listen toward the entrance. He knew the shape of danger before it arrived. That was what kept them both alive in places where intuition mattered more than rank. Down in Coldwater Bend, the mood stayed lighter than conditions warranted. Men gathered in the saloon and laughed about storms they had survived before. Women traded flour and lamp oil at Marlowe's store while children chased each other through packed snow. The sky pressed lower. Wind grew louder. Still, no one changed their routine. No one stacked extra wood. No one cut fresh kindling. No one asked whether past luck had been mistaken for wisdom. At the edge of town, in a small cabin that smelled of gun oil and coffee, Silas Hargrove stood at his window and studied the ridgeline. He was 68 years old, built lean by a lifetime spent outdoors, with a face weathered more by experience than years. He had worked as a park ranger for 30 seasons before his knees, and the budget both gave out. His wife Martha had died 10 years ago from a medical emergency that arrived faster than help could. He understood the cost of unpreparedness in ways that still woke him at night. Silas had been the first person in Coldwater Bend to treat Reese like someone worth listening to, instead of someone worth dismissing. He never asked about her past. He never questioned her methods. He simply watched her work and recognized competence when he saw it. Over 3 years, he had quietly supplied her with hardware she could not source locally. Hinges, piping, specialty screws. He never asked for payment beyond a nod. She never offered explanations beyond necessity. It was the kind of friendship built on mutual respect for what the other had survived, even if those survivals were never named aloud. Now, watching the storm gather weight, Silas felt the old dread rising. This was not a normal blow. The pressure was wrong. The wind direction was wrong. The way the animals had gone silent 2 days early was wrong. He pulled on his heavy coat and walked the quarter-mile to Marlowe's store. Inside, the usual crowd was debating how much snow would fall. 12 inches, maybe 15, Dalton said with the authority of a man who believed his land holdings translated to meteorological expertise. Less than that, Vernon countered. Wind will blow most of it into drifts. Roads will be clear by morning. Silas shook his head. You're both wrong. The room went quiet. Silas was not a man who spoke often, which meant when he did, even fools paused to listen. This is not a 12-inch storm, Silas continued. This is a break-the-pattern storm, the kind that shows up once every 50 years and reminds people that weather does not care about your experience. Dalton waved him off. You've been spending too much time with that woman on the hill. She's got you spooked. That woman, Silas said quietly, has more sense in her preparations than this entire town has in its assumptions. Vernon snorted. What's she preparing for the apocalypse? No, Silas replied. Just winter. Real winter. The kind you stop joking about once it arrives. He bought what he needed and left. No one followed him out. No one changed their plans. Confidence had settled over Coldwater Bend like fog, and fog made everything in the distance look smaller than it actually was. That evening, Silas climbed the mile to Reese's shelter. The trail was steep and his knees complained, but he had made the walk enough times to know where the footing stayed solid. Ash heard him coming from 100 yards out and barked once. By the time Silas reached the entrance, Reese was already at the door. Storm's worse than they think, Silas said without preamble. I know. Tried warning them. They won't listen until it's too late. Silas nodded. It was an old truth proven again and again. People change their minds slowly, but they change their circumstances fast. By the time belief caught up with reality, options had usually disappeared. "You have room for one more if it gets bad?" Silas asked. Reese studied him. Silas was not asking out of fear. He was asking out of practicality. He had seen enough winters to know when pride needed to step aside. "I have room," Reese said, "but you're not the one I'm worried about." She nodded toward the valley below, where lights were beginning to flicker on in windows that would soon be fighting to stay warm. Families who believed they were ready. Children who trusted the adults to keep them safe. A town that had mistaken repetition for preparation. Silas understood. If it goes bad, they'll come up here. Maybe. You'll let them in. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't build this place to choose who deserves warmth." It was the closest thing to a philosophy Silas had ever heard her state aloud. He nodded once and turned to leave. Halfway down the trail, he stopped and looked back. Reese was still standing in the doorway, backlit by lamplight ash at her side. She looked like a sentinel guarding something the world below did not yet understand it needed. Inside the shelter, Reese returned to her final checks. She walked the perimeter, testing every seal, every hinge, every rope tie. She fed the firebox 2 split logs and adjusted the draft. She filled the kettle and set it near the warm wool. She checked the fish tank, the growing beds, the water channel, the storage bins. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for 3 years. She had built this place in case winter came for someone the way it had come for Lily, and she arrived too late to matter. Lily's photograph watched from the shelf. 8 years old, bright ribbon, smile that trusted the world to be kind. Reese had been 2 states away when the storm hit Colorado. By the time she got the call and fought her way through closed roads and whiteout conditions, her brother's entire family had been found, frozen in their truck, buried under snow that fell faster than anyone predicted. The heater had run out of gas. The cold had been patient. Lily had died holding her mother's hand. Reese left the military 6 months later. She could still do the job, but she could not shake the thought that all her training, all her survival skills, all her knowledge meant nothing if she was not there when it mattered. So she found a place where winter was predictable and brutal. She studied the patterns. She built the shelter. She became the fool under the mountain. And she waited for the day when someone would need what she had learned from failing Lily. That night, wind began to scream through the pines. Snow hit the outer wall in bursts that sounded like fists on wood. Inside, lamplight flickered once, then held. The thermal mass wall radiated steady warmth. Water moved through the stone channel with the sound of a promise kept. Ash slept with his head on his paws, one ear still tracking the world outside. Reese sat on the edge of the warm bench and opened a small notebook she kept in her pack. Inside were sketches of the shelter's systems, notes on what worked and what needed adjustment, calculations for how long supplies would last under different scenarios. On the back page, written in careful letters, was a list of names. People in Coldwater Bend. Ages. Addresses. Medical conditions she had observed from a distance. Children who might need help if things went wrong. She had never shown the list to anyone. Most of the people on it had mocked her. Some had been cruel. But she had written them down anyway because survival was not a reward for virtue. It was a skill applied equally, or it meant nothing at all. Lily had been kind. Lily had done nothing wrong. Lily had died anyway. The lesson Reese learned was not that preparation prevented loss. It was that preparation was the only honest answer to a world that took without asking. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Inside, the shelter held. And on the valley floor below, Coldwater Bend settled in for a night they believed would be difficult, but survivable, never suspecting that by morning every assumption they carried would be tested against a winter that had stopped asking for permission. Wyatt Landry pressed his face against the cold glass of his bedroom window and watched snow begin to fall in thick, heavy flakes. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that never stayed combed and eyes that noticed more than adults gave him credit for. His father, Garrett, was a hunter and trapper who taught his son to read tracks and weather. His mother, Ivy, worked as the town's only nurse and carried worry like a second profession. Wyatt loved them both, but lately he had become fascinated by something else entirely. The woman on the mountain. He had seen her in town 3 times. Each time she moved differently than other adults. No wasted motion. No loud talking. She looked at things once and seemed to understand them completely. The dog that followed her never barked, never pulled at a leash that did not exist. They moved like 2 parts of the same creature, and Wyatt found that more interesting than anything happening in school. He asked his father about her once. Garrett had frowned and said, "Stay away from her. She's not right in the head." He asked his mother. Ivy had paused longer before answering. "She's been through things we don't understand. Best to leave her be." But Wyatt saw the way Reese carried herself, and it did not look like someone who was broken. It looked like someone who had been put back together with better materials. He wanted to know how that worked. He wanted to know what she was building up there. He wanted to know if the dog would let him pet it just once. Now, watching snow fall harder, Wyatt wondered if the woman on the mountain was watching the same storm. He wondered if she was scared. He wondered if anyone was ever strong enough that weather did not matter. His breath fogged the glass. Outside, wind began to rattle the window frame. Downstairs, his parents were talking in low voices about supplies and whether the clinic had enough medication if the roads closed. Wyatt pulled back from the window and climbed into bed. Tomorrow, he decided he would ask his father to take him up the mountain, just to see, just to know. He fell asleep imagining a shelter carved from stone lit by lamps that never went out, defended by a dog that never failed and built by a woman who looked at winter and refused to be impressed. In Marlowe's apartment above the general store, the old woman sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. She had pulled out a shoebox she had not opened in 15 years. Inside were photographs of a boy who never made it to 9. Michael, her son, lost in the blizzard of 1985 when she made the mistake of thinking she could wait out a storm in a house that was not ready. She found him the next morning 20 feet from the back door, frozen solid, one hand still reaching toward home. She had spent 40 years living with that image, 40 years wishing she had built better, prepared harder, taken winter seriously before it took everything that mattered. When Reese Thorne arrived in Coldwater Bend and started hauling stone up the mountain, Marlowe recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look she saw in her own mirror. The look of someone who had learned the cost of unpreparedness in the worst classroom possible. Now, holding Michael's photograph, Marlowe understood something the rest of the town did not. Reese was not hiding from people. She was building a monument to failure, shaped like readiness and fueled by the kind of grief that never stopped working. Marlowe set the photograph down gently and looked out the window at snow that was already beginning to accumulate faster than normal. She whispered to the empty room, "Let her be right. Let someone finally be right." Then she stood, pulled on her coat, and went downstairs to check her inventory one more time. If Silas and Reese were both worried, then worry was the only sensible response left. On the mountain, Reese fed the fire one more time, checked the draft, and settled onto the warm bench with Ash beside her. The dog's breathing was slow and steady. The shelter's systems hummed with the quiet efficiency of something built right. Outside, wind found every crack in the world and tested them all. Inside, warmth held. Reese closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. She listened to the wind, to the water, to Ash's breathing, to the sounds a mountain makes when it decides to remind the valley below that some lessons can only be taught in cold and darkness. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, she heard Lily's voice from 6 years ago asking a question she never got to finish. What happens if we get stuck, Aunt Reese? The answer Reese had built weighed 30 tons and sat carved into granite. It burned 2 logs at a time. It grew food in January. It filtered water from stone. And it would open its door to anyone who arrived before the cold claimed them, even if those people had spent 3 years laughing at the woman who built it. Snow fell harder. Wind screamed louder. And Coldwater Bend slept under blankets that would soon prove far too thin for what was coming. Morning arrived without light. The sky pressed down on Coldwater Bend like a lid on a coffin, gray and absolute. Dawn was supposed to bring definition to the world. Separation between earth and air. A sense that forward motion was still possible. Instead, it brought only a thin weakening of the dark, just enough to see that the storm had been building strength all night and had no intention of stopping. Snow fell at a rate that erased footprints before the boot lifted for a second step. 6 inches an hour, then 8. The kind of accumulation that turned roads into suggestions and landmarks into memories. Wind came from the north with a sound that made dogs whine and children press closer to their mothers. It was not the howl of a passing gust. It was the sustained roar of something that had settled in for a long stay. Inside homes across town, people woke to cold that had crept in during the night. Despite fires that had burned until midnight, floors felt like ice. Windows wore frost on the inside. Breath came out visible even in bedrooms. Men climbed out from under quilts and hurried to stoves that had gone dead in the small hours. They stuffed in kindling and wadded paper, struck matches with stiff fingers, and swore when the first flames guttered in drafts that found every gap in walls built decades ago by men who thought they understood winter. At the Pike Ranch, Dalton stood in his barn and listened to the roof timbers groan under weight. They were never designed to carry. 50 head of cattle pressed together in the main pen breath, rising in clouds, eyes showing white at the edges. The structure had stood for 30 years, Now it sounded like it was deciding whether to stand for 30 more minutes. He could hear snow sliding in avalanches off the upper slope of the roof. Each time the whole building shuddered. He thought about the woman on the mountain and felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not quite regret, not quite fear. Something closer to the feeling a man gets when he realizes he has been walking toward a cliff in the fog, and the fog just lifted. Vernon Cade stood in his mill office and stared at machinery that had frozen solid overnight. Pumps, hydraulics, the big diesel engine that powered the saw. Everything had seized. Condensation from the day before had turned to ice inside mechanisms that could not tolerate it. He had antifreeze. He had heat lamps. He had 3 decades of experience keeping equipment alive through cold snaps. None of it mattered. This was not a cold snap. This was a cold sentence, and it was being delivered without appeal. He thought about the jokes he had made, the way he had laughed at Reese Thorne's dirt walls and underground gardening, the way he had called her paranoid, the way she had looked at him without anger, just a kind of tired recognition that he was choosing ignorance over effort. Now his mill was dead, and her shelter was warm, and the gap between those two facts felt wider than the mile of mountain that separated them. In the small clinic attached to Marlowe's store, Ivy Landry did inventory and felt her stomach drop. Antibiotics for 3 weeks if no one got sick. Fever reducers for maybe 10 days. Bandages adequate. Splints adequate. IV fluids non-existent. She had requested more supplies 2 months ago. The distributor said they would come on the next truck. The next truck was not coming. Not today. Not this week. Maybe not this month. She thought about the notebook she kept, the one where she tracked the health issues in town. Vernon's heart condition that he refused to medicate properly. Old Thomas Brennan's diabetes. The Whitlock boy's asthma. Claire Morrison's migraines that turned serious when stress peaked. All manageable in normal times. These were not normal times. Times were about to become medical problems with no medical solutions. And Ivy knew enough to understand that when help could not arrive, people died in the order of their vulnerabilities. By noon, the first catastrophe announced itself with a sound like a shotgun blast. The roof over Dalton's cattle shed collapsed inward, snapping support beams that had been milled from old-growth pine. Snow poured through the gap. Cattle scattered bellowing in panic. 3 calves went down under fallen timber. Dalton and Boone fought through chaos and drifts to drag the survivors into an adjoining structure that was already overcrowded. By the time they finished, both men were soaked with sweat that would freeze if they stopped moving. The 3 calves did not survive. Dalton stood over them in snow that was already covering their bodies and understood that loss was just beginning its count. An hour later, water pipes began to burst. The first was at the Morrison house, the second at the Cassidy place, the third in the crawl space under Marlowe's store. Pressure from ice expanding inside copper lines exceeded what the joints could hold. Water sprayed into freezing air and became icicles before it hit the ground. Men grabbed wrenches and tried to shut off valves that had frozen open. Women grabbed buckets and tried to catch water that was already gone. Children watched their parents fight physics with tools, and physics won every round. By mid-afternoon, Coldwater Bend had lost running water in 11 buildings. Families started hauling buckets from hand pumps, praying the pump handles would still move. Some did. Some did not. The ones that did not became objects of mourning stared at by people who had never considered that access to water was a privilege that could be revoked by temperature. Wood supplies began to fail next. Families had stacked what they thought was enough. A cord here, 2 cords there. Assumptions based on winters that had been harsh but survivable. This winter was neither. Stoves that normally sipped fuel were now gulping it, burning through split logs at a rate that made arithmetic turn cruel. 2 days of fuel became 1 day. 1 day became half. Men started eyeing furniture. Chairs that had been in families for generations. Tables built by grandfathers. Bookshelves. Bed frames. Anything that would burn. Vernon made the walk to Marlowe's store through drifts that came to his thighs. The wind hit him like fists. By the time he pushed through the door, ice had formed in his beard, and his hands were too numb to feel the heat from the potbelly stove. Marlowe took one look at him and poured coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around the cup and waited for feeling to return in stabs of pain. "How bad?" Marlowe asked. "Bad," Vernon said. "Mill's dead. House is burning furniture. Gonna run out of things to burn by tomorrow night." Around the room, other men nodded. The jokes had stopped. The confidence had drained away. What remained was the hard arithmetic of survival, and none of the numbers were adding up the way they needed to. "Anyone try going up the mountain?" someone asked. Silence answered. It was one thing to admit you needed help. It was another to admit you needed help from the person you had mocked for 3 years. Pride was expensive fuel, and it burned hot, but it did not keep anyone warm. Silas stood from his chair near the stove. His voice came out quiet but cut through the room like an announcement. "I'm going up there, and anyone who wants to live through this should come with me." Dalton looked up. "You really think she'll help us after everything?" Silas met his eyes. "I think she built that shelter for exactly this moment. Question is whether you've got the sense to accept what she's offering before it's too late." No one moved at first. Then Marlowe reached for her coat. "I'm going." Ivy Landry stood. "Me too." One by one, the rest followed. Not because they wanted to, because the alternative was watching their families freeze in houses that were losing the fight. Pride could keep a man warm right up until it killed him. These men had just figured out they valued their children more than their reputations. They gathered what little they could carry: blankets, a sack of flour, salt pork, a crate of candles. Offerings that felt pathetic given what they were asking for, but offerings nonetheless. Then they pushed out into wind that tried to shove them back inside and started the climb toward the mountain. Up at the shelter, Reese was checking the trout tank when Ash went rigid. Both ears snapped forward. His whole body oriented toward the outer door like a compass finding north. He did not bark. He was past barking. He was in the mode that meant something critical was happening and sound was a luxury they could not afford. Reese moved to the entrance and listened. Wind. Snow hitting the walls. The groan of timber under pressure. Then beneath it all, something else. A sound that did not belong to weather. High-pitched. Distant. Fragile. Human. She grabbed her parka from the peg, pulled it on, and unbarred the door. Cold exploded inward like a living thing. Ash was already gone, launching into white darkness without hesitation. Reese followed one hand on the guideline she had rigged for exactly this scenario. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The world had been reduced to snow and wind and the shape of Ash's dark form ahead of her moving with purpose through drifts that would have stopped anything less committed. They found him 30 yards from the shelter beneath a pine that had bent almost horizontal under snow load. Ash was already digging, clawing through powder with frantic intensity. Reese dropped to her knees and swept snow aside with both arms. A small face appeared, pale skin, blue lips, eyes half open but not focused. One bare hand curled against a coat far too thin for the night he had tried to survive. Wyatt Landry, 8 years old, barely breathing. For one terrible second, Reese was not on a mountain in Wyoming. She was in Colorado 6 years ago, staring at another child who had run out of time. Lily's face superimposed over Wyatt's. Same age, same fragile stillness, same question that would never be answered now. The moment stretched threatening to break her, threatening to pull her back into the hole she had spent 6 years climbing out of. Then training kicked in. Muscle memory from a dozen extractions in worse conditions. She wrapped Wyatt inside her parka, lifted him against her chest, and turned back toward the shelter. His weight was nothing. The guilt was everything. She had built this place to save someone. Now someone was here. And if she failed, if she let cold win again, then Lily's death meant nothing, and this shelter was just a tomb she had furnished early. Behind them, their tracks vanished almost instantly. The mountain was erasing evidence that anyone had passed this way as if it wanted to keep the outcome uncertain. Inside the shelter, Reese moved with the kind of calm that looked like detachment, but was actually something harder. Control. She laid Wyatt on the thermal mass bench, not near the firebox, but at the center section, where heat distribution was most even. Sudden warmth could shock a body that was shutting down. Hypothermia killed in stages, and each stage required a different response. Rush it, and you traded one kind of death for another. She worked in order. Wet boots off first, then socks. She rubbed his feet dry with rough cloth, checking for frostbite. Toes were pale, but still had color. That was good. That was survivable. She wrapped them in wool that had been warming beside the wall. Gloves off next. Fingers flexed one by one. All present, all responsive. Coat removed carefully. Wet shirt peeled away and replaced with dry thermal layers from her own pack. Wyatt shivered so violently the bench trembled. His teeth chattered. His breath came in gasps. That was better than the alternative. Shivering meant the body had not given up. It meant the core was still trying to generate heat, still fighting. Silence would have meant surrender. Reese filled a metal cup with hot water from the kettle that lived permanently on the warm section of the bench. She stirred in honey and a pinch of salt. Calories. Electrolytes. Simple chemistry to give the body what it needed to restart its own furnace. She cooled the mixture to drinking temperature, then raised Wyatt's head gently and brought the cup to his lips. "Small sips," she said quietly. "No rush." His eyes opened partway, confused, scared. He tried to speak, but his jaw would not cooperate yet. "You're safe," Reese told him. "You're inside. You're warm. Just drink." He managed to sip. Then another. Color began creeping back into his cheeks, so slowly that only someone watching with complete focus would notice. Ash climbed onto the floor beside the bench and pressed himself against Wyatt's legs, adding body heat. The oldest form of warmth transfer there was. Dog to boy. Life to life. Steam rose from the cup. Lamplight touched the stone walls. Outside, wind clawed at the mountain and found nothing careless left to punish. Inside, a child who had been minutes from death began the long journey back. Reese checked his pulse. Steady. Checked his breathing. Deepening. Checked his skin temperature. Rising. She covered him with a blanket and sat back, allowing herself one full breath of relief. Then she looked at the photograph on the shelf. Lily, forever ate, forever smiling. The parallel was so exact it hurt. But this one time, she had been close enough. This time preparation beat delay. This time the shelter did what it was built to do. Wyatt's eyes opened fully. He looked around the shelter with the wonder of someone who had expected to die and found something else instead. Growing plants, moving water, a fish tank, warmth. His voice came out as a whisper. I thought nobody lived up here. I do, Reese said. I got lost. I wanted to see. I wanted to know if you were real. I'm real. Everyone says you're crazy. Reese almost smiled. Everyone's wrong about a lot of things. Wyatt's shivers began to slow. His breathing evened out. He was gonna be fine. Physically, at least. Emotionally, he would carry this for the rest of his life. The memory of cold. The memory of being found. The memory of warmth when he needed it most. Reese knew about memories like that. They shaped you. They changed the way you saw the world. For better or worse, Wyatt Landry would never look at Winter the same way again. She was refilling the cup when Ash's ears swiveled toward the door again. Different alert this time. Not frantic. Cautious. Someone else was out there. Multiple someones. Reese moved to the entrance and listened. Voices, muffled by wind, but definitely human. She cracked the door and saw shapes moving up the trail. A line of people struggling through drifts, holding on to each other, making slow progress toward the only light visible on the entire mountainside. Then she saw one figure separate from the group and fall. The person tried to stand collapsed again and did not move. Reese grabbed the storm lantern and went out into the blizzard for the second time in an hour. Ash stayed with Wyatt. Good dog. Prioritized the vulnerable. Reese fought her way to the fallen figure and found Dalton Pike face down in snow. One leg bent at an angle that legs were not designed to bend. He looked up at her with eyes that held pain and something that might have been shame. Blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow where he had hit a rock hidden beneath the snow. His voice came out hoarse. I was coming to apologize, to ask for help, to tell you that you were right. Reese knelt beside him and assessed the damage. Broken ribs, probably 2, maybe 3. Possible concussion. Mild hypothermia starting. He had come up the mountain in conditions that would kill most people driven by conscience or desperation or both, and now he was paying for it. She had every right to leave him there. Every moral justification. He had mocked her, dismissed her, made her the subject of jokes for 3 years. He represented everything about Coldwater Bend that had refused to listen. refused to prepare, refused to take seriously the idea that a woman might know more about survival than men who had lived here their entire lives. But Reese had not survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, had not earned a silver star, had not built this shelter just to become the kind of person who let others die because they deserved it. Survival was not a reward for virtue. It was a discipline applied equally, or it was nothing. "Can you stand?" she asked. "I can try." She got under his arm, took most of his weight, and hauled him upright. He gasped as broken ribs shifted. She adjusted her grip and started moving him toward the shelter. Each step was negotiated. Each breath was paid for in pain. But they made progress. Behind them, the rest of the group saw what was happening and pushed harder. Inside the shelter, Reese lowered Dalton onto the floor near the warm wall. Wyatt was sitting up now, watching with wide eyes. Ash positioned himself between the boy and the new arrival. Protective, but not aggressive. Reese grabbed her field medical kit, the one she had carried in the service, and went to work. She cut Dalton's shirt away and exposed ribs that were already bruising purple. She palpated carefully. 2 broken, 1 cracked. Nothing had punctured the lung. That was good. That was survivable. She wrapped his torso with compression bandages tight enough to stabilize, not so tight he could not breathe. She cleaned the cut on his forehead, applied pressure until the bleeding stopped, then closed it with butterfly strips. She checked his pupils. Even, responsive. Concussion was mild if present at all. "You'll live," she said. Dalton managed a weak laugh that turned into a cough that turned into a grimace. "Guess that means I have to face everyone knowing you saved the man who called you a fool." "I didn't save you because you earned it," Reese said. "I saved you because that's what this place is for." The outer door opened and Silas came through, followed by Marlowe Ivy and a dozen others. They brought wind and snow and cold with them. They brought shame and need and hope. They brought children who were shivering and adults who were failing. They brought the accumulated weight of an entire town that had bet on the wrong assumptions and lost. Reese stood and looked at them all. Silas met her eyes and nodded once, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of something that went beyond words. Marlowe's gaze went to the photograph on the shelf to Lily's face. An understanding passed between 2 women who had both lost children to cold and unpreparedness. Ivy saw Wyatt on the bench, and relief broke across her face like sunrise. Then Silas spoke, and his voice carried the weight of truth that could no longer be avoided. "This is Reese Thorne," he said to the gathered group. "Navy SEAL. 2 tours Afghanistan. Silver Star for valor under fire. She lost her daughter 6 years ago in a blizzard because she was too far away to save her. She came here and spent 3 years building what you see around you. Not because she's crazy, because she understands what happens when preparation meets winter, and what happens when it doesn't." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn piece of paper. A newspaper clipping. Reese recognized it immediately. The article about female SEALs completing training. Her photograph, younger in uniform, standing with 3 other women who had made it through the program that broke most men. Silas held it up so everyone could see. "While you were laughing at her, she was getting ready to save you. While you were calling her paranoid, she was proving that readiness is the only rational response to a world that doesn't care about your assumptions. While you were mocking her dirt walls, she was building the only structure in this valley that's still fully operational." The room went silent. Dalton, lying on the floor with broken ribs and bandaged head, closed his eyes. Vernon stared at his boots. Boone looked like someone had just explained that everything he thought he knew was backward. The children just looked around in wonder at growing plants and moving water and warmth that came from a wall instead of a stove. Reese let them process, let them sit with it, let them understand that competence was not always loud, and preparation was not always praised, and sometimes the people you dismissed were the ones who ended up saving your life. Wyatt's small voice broke the silence. Miss Thorne made me warm again. Ivy moved to her son, dropped to her knees beside the bench, and pulled him into an embrace that made words unnecessary. Garrett arrived moments later, snow-covered and wild-eyed, and the reunion happened in silence because some reliefs were too big for language. Then Garrett turned to Reese. "Thank you. I don't have words for what you did." "You don't need words," Reese said. "You need to help me organize this." Because the shelter was designed for 2 people, and there were now 23 inside with more arriving. The system could handle it, but only if everyone worked together. Only if pride stepped aside and competence took over. Only if the town that had refused to listen for 3 years finally understood that survival was a group effort guided by someone who knew what she was doing. Reese began issuing instructions, not requests, instructions. Her voice carried the tone of someone who had commanded in combat and knew the difference between discussion and execution. Children near the warmest section of the bench. Adults in rotation. Able-bodied men, you're on firewood detail and water management. Women, you're on food rationing and health monitoring. Elderly and injured, you stay warm and stay out of the way. People moved. Not because they wanted to take orders from the woman they had mocked. Because the alternative was chaos, and chaos in a storm was death by another name. Marlowe organized the children with the efficiency of someone who had run a store for 40 years and knew how to manage inventory, even when the inventory was frightened kids. Ivy began checking everyone for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Vernon and Boone started managing the firebox under Reese's guidance, learning in minutes what had taken her months to perfect. Silas worked beside Reese, helping adjust the system for load. It was never designed to carry. They moved supplies, redistributed weight, calculated rations, planned shifts. Through it all, Ash stayed near Wyatt, the boy's hand buried in the dog's fur. Both of them emanating the kind of calm that comes from surviving something terrible and finding safety on the other side. As night fell outside, the shelter held. 48 people packed into a space meant for 2, sustained by systems built by a woman who understood that grief could be channeled into preparation. And preparation was the only honest memorial to those who died because no one was ready. Reese stood near the entrance, watching her shelter transform into something she had never quite imagined, but had always hoped for. A refuge. A proof. A statement carved in stone and heated with patience that competence transcended gender, and readiness transcended acceptance. And sometimes the person everyone dismissed was the only one who actually understood the assignment. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent and absolute. Inside, lamplight touched faces that were learning what it meant to be saved by someone you had failed to respect. And on the shelf above the warm wall, Lily's photograph watched over a shelter that had just fulfilled the promise Reese made 6 years ago in a frozen truck on a Colorado mountain. This time, cold lost the final say. The first full night inside the shelter tested every system Reese had built. and every assumption the town had carried about how survival worked. 48 people created problems that 2 people never would. Body heat accumulated. Moisture from breathing condensed on cold surfaces. Personal space became a memory. Children cried. Adults shifted position every few minutes, trying to find comfort that did not exist. The air should have turned stale. The temperature should have spiked or crashed. The water should have run out. None of that happened. The thermal mass wall absorbed excess heat and redistributed it evenly. The ventilation system Reese had designed pulled fresh air from intake vents she had positioned, based on wind patterns she had studied for 3 years. Moisture stayed controlled. The fish tank continued its quiet circulation. The growing beds kept producing. The shelter did exactly what it was built to do, even under conditions that would have broken lesser designs. By midnight, a rhythm had established itself. Children slept in clusters near the warmest section, watched over by mothers who took turns resting. Men rotated through shifts at the firebox, learning that the system required patience, not volume. Feed it too much and you wasted fuel. Feed it too little and you lost the thermal momentum. It was a lesson in restraint taught by a woman who understood that survival was about efficiency, not excess. Reese moved through the shelter like a field commander, checking systems, adjusting rations, solving problems before they escalated. She had done this before in places where the stakes were higher and the margin for error was zero. Afghanistan had taught her that leadership was not about being liked. It was about keeping people alive long enough to learn from their mistakes. Dalton lay on a bedroll near the back wall, ribs wrapped tight, breathing shallow to minimize pain. He watched Reese work and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Humility. Real humility, not the performed kind that came after church on Sundays. The kind that arrived when you realized that everything you thought you knew was wrong, and the person you had dismissed as a fool was actually the only competent individual in the room. Vernon sat nearby his back against the stone wall, hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea. His mill was frozen solid. His house was burning through furniture. His entire understanding of winter had been revealed as inadequate. He watched Reese explain to Boone how the thermal mass worked, her voice patient, her instructions clear, and he understood that competence had no gender. It only had results. "I was wrong about her," Vernon said quietly. Dalton nodded. "We all were. Think she'll forgive us. Don't think she cares about forgiveness. Think she cares about whether we learn." It was the truest thing Dalton had said in years. Forgiveness was cheap. Change was expensive. Reese was not interested in apologies. She was interested in whether the people she saved would be worth saving the next time winter came. Near the growing beds, Silas worked with Ivy to inventory medical supplies. The shelter had basic first aid, but nothing for serious intervention. If someone had a heart attack, if infections set in, if complications developed, there were limits to what could be done. Ivy had brought what she could carry from the clinic. It was not enough. It was never enough. "We should have listened to you," Ivy said. 3 years ago when you tried to tell us she knew what she was doing." Silas shrugged. "Listening is easy when you're already comfortable. It's harder when someone's asking you to change before the crisis proves them right. She lost a daughter. I know. She built all this because she couldn't save her own child. I know that too." Ivy looked around the shelter at the systems that worked, at the people who were warm. at the children who were alive. Because one woman refused to let grief be the end of the story. What kind of strength does that take? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The kind that comes from failing at the thing that matters most. You either break or you build something that makes sure it never happens again." She built. Across the room, Marlo sat with Wyatt telling him a story to keep his mind off the storm. But her eyes kept drifting to the photograph on the shelf. Lily Thorne. 8 years old. The same age Michael had been. The same bright face. The same trust that the world would be kind. Marlo had spent 40 years carrying the weight of a choice she made too slowly. By the time she understood the storm was serious, by the time she tried to prepare, Michael was already gone. 20 feet from the back door, hand reaching toward home frozen solid. She had told no one that story in 15 years. It sat inside her like a stone cold and permanent. But looking at Lily's photograph, looking at Reese moving through the shelter with quiet efficiency, Marlo understood that some stones were meant to be shared. Not for forgiveness, for recognition. So that one person who carried similar weight would know they were not alone. When the children finally settled into sleep, Marlo stood and walked to where Reese was checking the water filtration. She waited until the younger woman finished her task, then spoke quietly. "I know why you built this." Reese looked at her, said nothing, waited. "I lost my son in the blizzard of 1985, Marlo continued. "Michael, he was 8. I thought we could wait out the storm in the house. I thought I had enough wood. I thought I knew what I was doing. I was wrong. Found him the next morning, 20 feet from the door." Reese's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition. The kind that only comes from shared experience of a specific kind of loss. "I spent 40 years wishing I had been smarter," Marlo said. "Wishing I had prepared better. Wishing I had taken winter seriously before it took everything that mattered. Then you showed up and started building this, and I recognized the look in your eyes. It's the same one I see in the mirror. I'm sorry about your son," Reese said quietly. "I'm sorry about your daughter." Marlo paused. "But I'm grateful you turned your loss into this. I turned mine into regret. You turned yours into readiness. That's the difference between us. Readiness doesn't bring them back, no, but it saves the ones who come after. That boy over there, Wyatt, he's alive because you refused to let grief be the end of the story. Michael died because I didn't know any better. But maybe his death taught me to recognize what you were doing. Maybe that's something." Reese looked at Lily's photograph, then back at Marlo. "It's something," she agreed. They stood together in silence for a moment. Two women separated by decades and united by loss. Both understanding that survival was not about erasing the past. It was about making sure the past informed the future in ways that mattered. By the second day, the shelter had transformed from a crisis response into a functioning community. Reese organized work details with military precision, assigning roles based on competence rather than age or gender or social status. Silas managed the water systems because he understood plumbing and pressure. Vernon handled mechanical repairs because his mill work had taught him troubleshooting. Dalton, even with broken ribs, advised on livestock management because 30 years of ranching had given him knowledge worth using. Marlowe ran the medical station with Ivy, tracking symptoms, distributing the limited medications they had, making hard decisions about who needed what most urgently. Faye Whitlock organized education for the children, turning crisis into curriculum, teaching them about thermal dynamics and water filtration and survival science. Boone learned from everyone, his young pride stripped away by the realization that competence came from experience, not assumption. And Reese moved through it all like a conductor, not dominating but directing, not controlling but coordinating. She had learned in the military that leadership was about making people better than they thought they could be. The best officers did not do everything themselves. They identified talent, assigned tasks, provided guidance, then stepped back and let competence do its work. Men who had never taken orders from a woman found themselves doing exactly that, not because gender norms had shifted, but because survival required setting aside stupidity. When the firebox needed feeding, Reese's instructions were followed because following them meant staying warm. When water needed rationing, her calculations were trusted because she had done the math correctly. When conflicts arose over space or resources, her decisions were accepted because she had earned authority through results, not rank. Dalton found himself working alongside Vernon, two men who had spent 3 years reinforcing each other's dismissal of Reese, now learning from her in silence. They fed the firebox together, taking turns measuring splits, adjusting the draft according to her specifications. The system worked. That was undeniable. Every assumption they had carried about how heating worked was revealed as incomplete at best, wasteful at worst. "I've been burning wood wrong for 30 years, Dalton said quietly. Vernon nodded. Same. Thought more fire meant more heat. Turns out more fire just means more waste. She tried to tell us. 3 years ago, she tried to explain the thermal mass concept. I laughed. We all did. They were quiet for a moment, watching flame move through split pine heat, traveling sideways through ceramic pipe before escaping into the cold outside. The elegance of it was undeniable. The efficiency was measurable. The fact that they had dismissed it without understanding was inescapable. "What do we do when this is over?" Vernon asked. "We build better," Dalton said. "We learn from someone who actually knows what she's doing. We stop pretending that experience is the same as expertise." It was the closest thing to an apology either man would voice aloud. But it was also a commitment. Change, not just remorse. Action, not just words. On the third day, Wyatt approached Reese while she was checking the fish tank. The boy had recovered fully, his color returned, his energy restored. But something in him had changed. He moved differently, spoke differently, looked at the world with eyes that had seen how close death actually was. "Miss Thorne," he said, "can I ask you something? You can ask. Will you teach me how to build a place like this?" Reese looked at him. 8 years old, the same age Lily had been. The same age Marlowe's son had been. The same age that seemed to be the universe's preferred target when Winter wanted to teach lessons about preparation. "Why?" she asked. "Because I don't want to be scared anymore. I don't want to hope someone saves me. I want to know how to save myself. And maybe other people too." It was the most adult thing Reese had heard from anyone in 3 days. Most of the grown men in the shelter were still processing the fact that their assumptions had failed. This 8-year-old had already moved past failure and into planning. Some people learn from experience. Others learn from near death. Wyatt had received both lessons at once. It takes years, Reese said. Takes patience. Takes understanding that every detail matters. I have years. I have patience. I want to learn. Reese felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite pain. Not quite hope. Something between the two. Teaching meant opening up about Lily. Teaching meant explaining why every system existed. Teaching meant sharing the grief that had built this place stone by stone. But teaching also meant Lily's death had created something beyond survival. It had created knowledge transfer. It had created a generation that would understand preparation not as paranoia, but as responsibility. Emma Rose Kane had died because the adults around her were not ready. Wyatt Landry was alive because one adult had spent 6 years getting ready. If Wyatt learned if he passed it on, then maybe readiness could become normal instead of exceptional. All right, Reese said. First lesson starts now. See that fish tank? Explain to me why it matters. Wyatt studied it, thought carefully, then said, because it's protein that stores itself. You don't have to hunt. You don't have to preserve meat. You just keep the water moving and the fish stay alive until you need them. Reese almost smiled. The boy understood systems thinking. Most adults never got there. Good. What else? The waste from the fish feeds the plants. So it's not just food. It's fertilizer too. Everything connects. Better. Now tell me why the water has to move. They talked for 20 minutes. Reese asking questions, Wyatt answering, both of them building understanding through dialogue. Garrett watched from across the room, his initial instinct to protect his son from the strange woman, replaced by recognition that his son was learning from someone who actually knew what she was teaching. When the lesson finished, Wyatt returned to his parents, but his eyes kept drifting back to the systems. The thermal wall, the growing beds, the water channel. He was already mapping it in his mind, already planning what he would build when he grew up. Reese had just planted a seed that would grow for decades. Silas approached her after Wyatt left. You're teaching him. Someone should. You realize what that means? It means one more person will know how to survive next time. It means you're building legacy. It means Lily's death created something that will outlive all of us. Reese was quiet for a long time. Then she said, that's the only memorial that matters, not a gravestone. A skill set passed on. Silas nodded. He understood. Martha had died because they did not have medical equipment close enough, fast enough. He had spent 10 years wishing he had prepared better. Now he was watching someone who had actually done the work of turning loss into readiness. It was the most honest form of grief he had ever witnessed. On the 5th day, the wind began to weaken. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in degrees that could be measured by those paying attention. The constant roar dropped to occasional gusts. The gusts dropped to restless drafts. Then, for the first time in a week, silence spread across the mountain. Real silence. The kind that felt unfamiliar after days of noise. Reese stood at the entrance and watched the sky. Cloud cover was thinning. A pale shaft of sunlight broke through and touched the upper ridge. Then another. Then the valley below emerged from white into definition. The storm was not gone, but it was leaving. Winter had made its point. Those who listened had survived. Those who had not were already counting losses. People began to stir with the kind of hope that comes when the worst has passed. Children pressed faces against the small windows Reese had installed. Adults stood and stretched muscles that had been cramped for days. The shelter had held. The systems had worked. 53 people had sheltered here at the peak, and all 53 were still breathing. Marlowe started organizing the return to town. Some people would need to go soon to check on homes and livestock. Others would need to stay until conditions improved further. Reese helped coordinate, making sure no one went out unprepared, making sure everyone understood that the storm weakening did not mean winter was finished. Dalton approached her before leaving. His ribs were wrapped. His face was still bruised, but he could move under his own power. He stopped in front of Reese and met her eyes. "I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I called you a fool. I laughed at what you built. I dismissed your warnings. I'm the fool and you saved my life anyway. I didn't save you because you earned it. I saved you because that's what this place is for. I know. That makes it worse. You built this for people like me, and we mocked you for it." He paused. "I want to make this right. You want to make it right, you stop mocking and start learning. You go back to your ranch and you rebuild using what you learned here. You teach others. You spread the knowledge instead of hoarding the pride." Dalton nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Then do it." They shook hands. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was two people acknowledging that competence had been demonstrated and respect had been earned, and the future would be built on those foundations instead of the rubble of old assumptions. Vernon left next. Then Boone, then others in small groups. Each one thanked Reese on the way out. Each one carried something they had not brought with them. Understanding, humility, knowledge. The shelter emptied in stages until only Silas, Marlowe, Ivy, Garrett, Wyatt, and a few others remained. Reese walked the perimeter, checking for damage, assessing what needed repair. The systems had been stressed but not broken. Some supplies would need replenishing. Some tools would need maintenance. But the core structure had proven itself. The thermal wall had performed exactly as designed. The water filtration had kept pace. The growing beds had continued producing. Every calculation had been validated. Every assumption had been tested. Everything had worked. 6 weeks later, the mountain looked different. 3 structures now sat on the western slope visible from town. The original shelter. A second one half a mile south, designed by Reese and built by Dalton's crew. And a third under construction near the tree line, this one a community project involving 20 volunteers working in shifts. The town had changed too. A new protocol existed, now unofficial, but universally accepted. The Thorn Protocol, they called it, though. Reese never used that name herself. It was a checklist, a standard, a set of requirements for winter readiness that included backup heating, water storage, food reserves calculated by person days, instead of guesswork, and emergency shelter plans that accounted for worst-case scenarios. Homes were being retrofitted. Ranches were installing backup systems. The mill had been redesigned with cold weather operation in mind. Vernon had spent 2 weeks learning thermal mass principles from Reese, then applied them to a new equipment shelter that could maintain operational temperatures without consuming fuel like a furnace. The general store now carried supplies that Marlowe had never stocked before. Water filters, emergency blankets, specialized tools for shelter building, seeds for cold weather crops. She kept a notebook behind the counter where people could write down what they learned, creating a community knowledge base that would outlive any individual memory. At the school, Faye Whitlock had created a new curriculum. Survival science, she called it. Every student learned thermodynamics, water purification, food preservation, and shelter design. They learned from textbooks, but they also learned from field trips to Reese's shelter, where the woman who had saved their town explained how systems worked and why details mattered. Wyatt Landry attended every class, took notes in careful handwriting, asked questions that revealed genuine understanding. He had become Reese's informal apprentice, showing up at the shelter twice a week to help with maintenance and learn through doing. Garrett no longer worried. He had watched his son transform from a reckless 8-year-old into someone who understood that survival was not about bravery. It was about preparation meeting opportunity. On a clear afternoon in early March, Reese stood outside her shelter with Silas watching the construction crew work on the third building. Dalton was there, moving slower because of ribs that were still healing but moving nonetheless. Vernon operated a pulley system he had designed based on principles Reese taught him. Boone mixed mortar with the precise ratios she had specified. They were learning, actually learning, taking knowledge and applying it without ego or resistance. "You changed this town," Silas said. "Winter changed this town. I just gave them a place to survive it." "No. You gave them an example. You showed them what preparation looks like when someone actually commits to it. Half the houses in Coldwater Bend are being winterized right now because people finally understand that readiness is not paranoia." Reese watched the construction for a moment. Then she said, "Lily would have liked this. She always asked questions, always wanted to know how things worked. She would have been good at this." "She is good at this," Silas said quietly. "Through you. Everything you built because of her. That means she's still here, still teaching, still saving lives. Just doing it through a mother who refused to let grief be the end of the story." Reese looked at him. Silas had lost Martha 10 years ago. He understood that the dead did not leave instructions for the living. They left absences that could be filled with meaning or with emptiness. Reese had chosen meaning. She had chosen to build. And now an entire town was building with her. "You should teach more," Silas said, formally. "Start a school. People would come. People mocked me for 3 years. People were wrong for 3 years. They know it now. They want to learn. And you're the best teacher they'll ever have because you paid for your knowledge with loss. That kind of education stays with people." Reese considered it. A school, a formal program, structured knowledge transfer instead of improvised lessons. It would mean talking about Lily more. It would mean explaining the why behind every system. It would mean opening wounds that had started to scar. But it would also mean Lily's death created ripples that spread beyond Coldwater Bend. It would mean other children might survive because one woman turned private grief into public knowledge. "I'll think about it," Reese said. Silas smiled. "That's all I'm asking." That evening, Reese returned to her shelter and found it quieter than it had been in weeks. No crowds, no crisis, Just her and Ash and the systems that worked. She fed the fish, checked the growing beds, adjusted the firebox, ran through her maintenance routine with the calm of someone who had found peace in preparation. Then she sat on the thermal mass bench and looked at Lily's photograph. 6 years had passed since Colorado. 6 years since she failed to arrive in time. 6 years since she decided that failure would become fuel instead of finish. "They're learning, Lily," she said quietly. "Wyatt asks about you sometimes. Wants to know what you were like. I tell him you were curious, smart, brave in the way kids are brave before the world teaches them to be afraid. He reminds me of you." Ash climbed up beside her, rested his head on her lap. The dog had been there for all of it. Afghanistan, Colorado, Wyoming. Every choice, every failure, every success. He had never left her side. "I'm going to teach them," Reese continued. "Really teach them. Start a program. Make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else if I can prevent it. That's the memorial you deserve. Not a stone with your name on it. A generation that knows how to survive because you didn't." The photograph said nothing back. It never did. But Reese felt something settle inside her chest. Not quite peace. Not quite closure. Something better than both. Purpose that extended beyond personal survival. Legacy that would outlive her lifetime. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Wyatt and Garrett standing outside, both carrying shovels. "We're here for lesson 2, Wyatt said. "You said we'd learn about drainage systems today." Reese looked at Garrett. The man who had once warned his son to stay away from the strange woman on the mountain now stood beside that same son, ready to learn from her. "Drainage starts with understanding water flow," Reese said. "Come on, I'll show you." They spent 2 hours outside Reese explaining how runoff worked, how to channel it away from structures, how to prevent erosion while harvesting what could be stored. Wyatt took notes. Garrett asked intelligent questions. Both of them absorbed knowledge with the hunger of people who had seen what happened when preparation met winter and wanted to make sure they were on the right side of that equation next time. When they left, Reese stood at the entrance and watched them walk down the trail together. Father and son both carrying knowledge that would shape the next 50 years of their lives. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the valley in colors that made the snow look less hostile and more beautiful. Coldwater Bend spread out below, lights flickering on in windows. Smoke rising from chimneys that now understood efficiency. The town that had mocked her for 3 years was now learning from her. The people who had called her a fool were now calling her a teacher. The place that had dismissed her warnings was now building its future on the foundations she had laid. Silas appeared on the trail, moving slowly but steadily. He reached the shelter and stopped beside her, both of them looking down at the valley. "Dalton's naming the new shelter after you," Silas said. "Thorn Station. Says it's only right since you designed it. I don't need my name on it. It's not about what you need. It's about what they need. They need to remember that competence matters more than comfort, and preparation matters more than pride. Your name on that building reminds them every day." Reese was quiet. Then she said, "Martha would be proud of you." Silas looked at her, surprised. Reese never talked about personal things. She kept everything locked behind professionalism and distance. This was different. This was acknowledgement between two people who had both survived loss and chosen to build instead of break. "Martha would be proud of both of us," Silas said. "We're doing what she and Lily can't. We're learning from their deaths. We're making sure those lessons keep other people alive. That's the only memorial that matters." They stood together as darkness claimed the valley. Inside the shelter, lamplight glowed warm. The thermal mass wall radiated heat. It had stored all day. Water moved through channels cut by hand. Fish swam in tanks built with patience. And on a shelf above it all, a photograph of a girl who would never grow old, watched over a legacy that would never stop growing. 3 months later, the Winter Survival School held its first official class. 15 students, 8 men, 5 women, 2 teenagers. All of them learning from a woman who had earned her knowledge through service and loss and 3 years of building while everyone laughed. Reese stood in front of them with a piece of chalk and a blackboard Silas had installed. Behind her, the shelter's systems hummed with quiet efficiency. Beside her, Ash sat calm and watchful. In the front row, Wyatt took notes with intense focus. "Survival is not about being tough," Reese began. "It's about being ready. Toughness runs out. Readiness compounds. Every system you build, every skill you learn, every backup plan you create makes the next crisis easier to handle. That's what this school teaches. Not heroism, readiness." She drew a diagram on the board. Thermal mass, water filtration, food production, backup systems. The students copied it down. Some of them were people who had mocked her 3 years ago. Some were people who had sheltered here during the storm. All of them were people who had decided that learning from failure was better than repeating it. For 2 hours, Reese taught. She explained principles, demonstrated techniques, answered questions with patience earned from years of watching people fail, because they had not been taught better. When the class ended, students filed out carrying knowledge that would shape how they approached winter for the rest of their lives. Wyatt stayed behind. He helped Reese clean the blackboard, organize supplies, reset the space for the next session. They worked in comfortable silence, two people who understood that competence was built through repetition and that teaching was just another form of preparation. "Miss Thorne," Wyatt said finally, "do you think Lily would be proud?" Reese stopped, looked at the photograph on the shelf, thought about the question that no one had asked in 6 years. Would Lily be proud that her death had created all this? Would she understand that her aunt had turned grief into systems, loss into legacy, failure into preparation, that saved dozens of lives? "I think," Reese said slowly, "that Lily would be glad other kids didn't have to go through what she went through. I think she'd be happy that her story became a lesson instead of just a tragedy. I think she'd want me to keep teaching until everyone understood that winter doesn't care about your assumptions. It only cares about your readiness." Wyatt nodded. "Then I'll help you teach. When I'm older, when I know enough, I'll help spread what you taught me." It was a promise from an 8-year-old boy who had almost died and decided to spend his life making sure others did not. Reese felt tears threaten for the first time in years, but she blinked them back. Tears were private. Teaching was public. She had chosen the latter. "Deal," she said. They shook hands, adult to adult, teacher to student, survivor to survivor. Outside, spring was arriving, slowly melting snow. revealing ground that had been buried for months. The valley was waking up. The town was rebuilding. And on the mountain, in a shelter carved from stone and heated by patience, knowledge was being transferred from one generation to the next in the only memorial that actually mattered. That night, Reese added a new photograph to the shelf. Beside Lily's smiling face, she placed a picture of the first graduating class from the Winter Survival School. 15 people who now understood that preparation was not paranoia. Readiness was not weakness. And sometimes the person everyone dismissed was the only one who actually understood what survival required. She stood back and looked at both images, one representing loss, one representing legacy, both teaching the same lesson in different languages. The world was not safe. Winter was not kind. But readiness could tip the balance just enough that when crisis arrived, you were the one who helped instead of the one who needed help. Ash settled at her feet. The thermal mass wall radiated its slow, steady warmth. Water moved through channels that would keep flowing as long as someone maintained them. The shelter held its peace. And Reese Thorne, 43 years old, former Navy SEAL woman under the mountain teacher of survival, builder of legacy, finally allowed herself something she had not felt since Colorado. Hope that the future would be ready for winter because she had taught it how.